Good morning, everybody. Thank you so very much for your time today. My name is Michael Nelson, the Customer Experience Manager for LexisNexis. Today, I'm joined by some esteemed colleagues of mine, looking at the way that the rapid development in AI over the course of the last 3 years has prompted efforts to begin to lay down some frameworks around how to govern what's happening in that space. There's a number of topics today which I look forward to, together with my colleagues, sharing with you. But thank you again for making the time to join us. And we will press on. As I mentioned, I'm joined by some colleagues. I have Michael Howell with me, who's the Head of Risk Research and Knowledge at Protecht. Claire Linwood, Local Lead Product for LexisNexis Regulatory Compliance, and the Head of Content Global for LexisNexis Regulatory Compliance as well. I might start with Michael. Would you like to do a brief introduction?
Thanks, Michael. Glad to be here. So I'm the Head of Risk Research and Knowledge at Protecht. Title probably says a fair bit about what that covers. Love the world of risk, and especially moving into the world of AI and thinking about how we can manage the risks effectively of AI.
Thank you very much indeed. There's ample scope for that. Claire, a little about you.
Thanks so much, Michael. Delighted to be with you all today to talk about all things AI. So my name's Claire Linwood. I'm Local Product Lead here at LexisNexis Regulatory Compliance. Previously worked in product management on the legal research side of our business, including with AI-enabled products. So yeah, really excited to be here today.
Thank you. And finally, Kieran.
Thanks so much, Michael. I'm very pleased to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, or whatever time it happens to be when you're listening in on this session, whether live or after the fact. So I'm Kieran. I head up the content team for the regulatory compliance business. Everything related to the words on the page that we produce flows through my team. Everything from our modules of content to support customers with navigating their obligations and also navigating their regulatory change requirements. AI is a crucial part of how we create content and deliver content to our customers, so very much looking forward to the conversation today.
Marvelous. Thank you very much. So speaking of the conversation today, here is today's agenda. So we'll do a brief run through about what Protecht as a solution can offer and the LexisNexis regulatory compliance solution for those who aren't across either or both of those. Then we'll explore what's happening in the EU around AI regulation and what broadly we're trying to achieve when it comes to regulating AI. Then looking at the current state of play when it comes to the Australian approach. And then finally look at the role that agentic AI is increasingly playing in this landscape. And then finally, Q&A. There is inevitably in these sorts of things a little housekeeping, so we'll keep this brief. Today we'll be running approximately an hour. If you have any questions as they come up, please feel free to use the Q&A panel that's available to you. There is scattered throughout a range of QR codes. Please feel free, as you can at the moment, raise your phone to the screen and have a look at some of the supporting material that's available to you through this particular webinar. And then finally, relax, make yourselves comfortable, and look forward to taking you on what I suspect will be a fascinating journey. So we'll first start with Protecht, and I'd like to invite Michael Howell to just give a quick précis about what Protecht is and how it can help.
Thank you, Michael. So Protecht is a provider of GRC solutions, especially our SaaS product. So it was founded by two ex-chief risk officers who wanted to do things better in the world of risk. So our software covers things like risk management, compliance management, vendor risk management, and of course, AI is definitely a component of that now as well. We're developing our products into the service itself, as well as including AI governance tools for our customers so they can manage AI better themselves. So what makes us stand out is that we are built by risk experts. So I'm a bit of a risk nerd, and there are many other risk nerds at Protecht, and that's really shown out, I guess, in our retention rates, world-class retention rates for our customers, because we are partners, not just a software solution provider. Over to you.
Done. Thank you very much, Michael. And that's a really key point. I think that there's a lot of software companies out there, but having a software company that's augmented and built around the service that it's trying to achieve and software as a tool rather than an outcome is, I think, one of the key reasons why we partner so well with Protecht. Now, when I say we, of course, I'm talking about LexisNexis regulatory compliance. For those who don't know, LexisNexis has been around for about 200 years. We started in 1819 in London, and we've been providing legal research for the best part of those last 200 years. About a decade ago, we formed the view that the kind of people who were good at providing commentary on case law and legislation for lawyers would be equally good at providing meaningful commentary and support and guidance around the risk and compliance space. We have a solution that transitions seamlessly into the Protecht platform that allows you to identify what your organization might need to look to when it comes to compliance, what broader operational controls might be appropriate to adopt, what risks might be associated with breach. And we support those registers both in terms of an alerting solution that keeps you up to speed on what changes are occurring, but also where changes occur, those flow into the obligation registers themselves. So you've always got a sense of what the landscape looks like today, but also how that landscape might shift in the future and how those shifts may affect you. Now, before we get started, we thought we'd take a read of the room. So there'll be a poll available to you. And I guess the question is, how well prepared you feel you are as an organization when it comes to looking at the way that AI is managed around the world. Are you alive to and prepped for where we're at? Or are you still coming to terms with it? Are you alive to what's vaguely happening? Or is it all a complete blank? I'd love to get your feedback. And I think this is a really interesting point in history when it comes to AI, because it seems that it's crept very slowly upon us for the course of the last sort of, let's say, 80 years or so, since Alan Turing first came up with the concept of how do we identify artificial intelligence. But the last 5 or so years, it's really come on the rush. And there's been so much change. And even as we speak, the world that we looked at even 2 or 3 years ago when it comes to AI has changed enormously. And it'll be interesting to see how people are responding to something that's changing quite as rapidly as it is. Now, I believe the poll results are being shared at the moment.
Yeah, you can see the majority there, Michael, 55% aware, but know that they need to adapt. So that's probably not too surprising that that's the majority.
Yeah, and that's good, because I think that particularly in the Australian environment, there have been instances, and we'll talk about these in more detail later today, but really awareness is probably where we're at, apart from those particular guidance notes and suggestions and fed into existing regulatory frameworks. But aware is a good place to start. I'm glad to hear that more than half of everyone on the call are aware of where we're at. So let's move on. As I touched on before, AI has really hit escape velocity in the last couple of years, which has, of course, prompted a response from governments and regulatory agencies around the world. Responses, however, have varied. The first, and perhaps this isn't surprising, the first regulatory regime to land has come out of the European Union. And so I guess what I'd like to do is firstly turn to Kieran to explore exactly what they're trying to achieve with this initial tranche of regulatory reform.
Thanks so much, Michael. And before I start, I did just want to, looking at the results that we just heard from the last poll, I think it's quite, to Michael Howe's point, it's quite perhaps unsurprising that there is this sense that we do need to adapt to the pace of regulatory change and recognizing that there is a lot going on and there's a lot of shifts happening in the global regulatory landscape, not just around AI, but obviously when we look at the volume of activity in this space, it is an area that is getting a lot of organizational attention and regardless of whether you feel as though there might be resource constraints or a level of organizational inertia or some competing priorities that you're navigating, that there is a sentiment to shift across that. And perhaps gaining a stronger understanding of the way that this landscape is shifting. And perhaps that's something we can support with today. Maybe that's part of the path forward that we can support you with navigating. But turning back to Europe and what's happening in the EU around AI regulation, well, a good place to start, I guess, is looking at the new European AI Act, which is widely regarded as really the first comprehensive legal framework for artificial intelligence globally. Now, the AI Act is not just a regulatory milestone, it's a bit of a blueprint. Much like the GDPR was for global data privacy, the EU AI Act is positioning itself as a bit of a gold standard for AI governance globally. Its phased rollout, its risk-based classification, and its extraterritorial reach make it a model that a lot of other countries are looking at quite closely. Now, I touched upon that risk-based system, and that's really the Act's most defining feature. It doesn't regulate AI as a monolith, it tailors obligations to the level of risk. And that potentially allows for innovation at the edges while tightening controls where stakes are highest. Broadly speaking, the Act classifies AI systems into 4 risk tiers. So you've got unacceptable risk AI, so those like social scoring or biometric surveillance, and these are prohibited AI systems. Then you've got high risk systems where they have very strict obligations, requirements around risk assessments, human oversight, transparency and registration. Limited risk, which is where these systems need to meet transparency requirements, so disclosure that users are interacting with AI. And then minimal risk AI systems. So these are largely unregulated, but organizations are encouraged to follow voluntary codes of conduct. To the question of what are we actually trying to achieve? What is the EU trying to achieve with this? What are countries, blocks trying to achieve with AI regulation? If we look at the way that the legislation is structured, it does come down to this building a sense of trust and building a strong framework around a technology like this, making sure that use of AI can be safe and trustworthy, to continue to prevent harm to society from discrimination in hiring algorithms to manipulation of vulnerable populations, making sure that there's human oversight in these processes and to foster innovation responsibly. I think another key thing to highlight when we think about what is being achieved is to have ethical considerations and debates around use of AI. Fundamentally, it's an ethical framework, the EU legislation. It's not just a technical one. It's built on the premise that AI must serve people, not power, and that innovation needs to align with key, European values, but human values, dignity, fairness, and democracy. These kinds of ethical concerns are inherent in the legislation, and they're things that I think will start to come through as we walk through the discussion. But recognizing the need to consider in developing or implementing an AI system, elements of bias and discrimination, management of privacy and surveillance, autonomy of usage of information, transparency and accountability, and then as a content guy, content integrity. So ensuring that generative AI systems avoid misinformation and respect copyright as well. Now, one thing I will highlight just to when we talk about legislation, it's something I bring up in a lot of context when we talk about regulation, but the EU AI Act isn't just for AI developers. I'm not sure who is listening to this webinar, but if you're asking yourself, why should I care? Why are we talking about this? I'm based in Australia. Why are we talking about Europe? It's important to think about that any business that builds, buys, sells, or uses AI systems, particularly in high impact areas like HR or finance or healthcare, might be falling within the purview of this legislation. So regardless of whether you're inside the EU or outside, it's something to consider as to whether there's a requirement for compliance or whether you can align to it as a benchmark for best practice. I guess the jury will be out as to whether or not this framework has achieved what it set out to do. Like, has it actually been successful in what it achieved? I guess one thing to think about is, yes, there's been a framework put in place, but there's growing debate about whether the framework can adapt quickly enough to emerging risks and capabilities, particularly around things like agentic AI and autonomous systems. And it's at that critical juncture that we find ourselves today as companies work to balance the risks and opportunities of AI.
Thanks for the great segue into agentic AI, Kieran. So Michael mentioned earlier, AI goes back a long way. So we're talking about a history of about 80 years, going back to Alan Turing and the Turing test. And since then, AI has gone through many different evolutions, including a number of different what are called AI winters, where there was very little research and progress. And you will have noticed in the last few years, there's been an enormous amount of progress in AI. And the latest paradigm in that progress is what you might have heard described as agentic AI, AI agents. There's some debate about exactly what is an AI agent versus agentic AI, but you might have heard quite a bit about this, particularly recently. So if we think back to 2022 and the release of ChatGPT, generative AI, that was a step change in what was possible in AI. The creation of new content, including text and images, video, code, that was a step change to what was available and possible technologically previously, prior to 2022. But it was very much, and is still very much, a back and forth between the user and the system. So if we're thinking of an agent, that's something that can perform tasks autonomously. It has a lot of agency in how it goes about achieving those tasks. Generative AI, more reliant on the user prompt and then the system giving a response back. So in terms of what an agent is, it's got a few characteristics, including proactivity, continuous learning, organizing towards objectives. So you can imagine that raises a few distinct risks as compared to just a generative AI system, which is a back and forth between the user and the system, and there's a lot of control still vested in the user. So obviously this raises risks that fall within the EU AI Act. We can talk a bit more about that later, but this is something that you might hear quite a lot of these days and in the future, this agentic AI paradigm, and what does it raise in terms of risks.
Thank you, Claire. That's fascinating. The first thing that sprang to mind was a question about where an agent, an AI agent, might fall into the legal definition of an agent, i.e. someone acting on behalf of somebody else.
Question. Yeah, I won't go there in terms of the actual legal definition, but that has been raised as an issue in the law of principal and agent. Where does the AI agent fall? Yeah, definitely, I think, an open question.
Yeah, it's. I think there is enormous scope. I mean, just as we saw, the philosophical questions around the trolley car experiment suddenly become enlivened when people started talking about self-driving cars. One of the fascinating aspects, and we may not, it underpins, I think, the broad discussion that we're having today, the philosophical questions around how we approach something like this. Kieran mentioned the European notion of dignity and other human rights, and the notion of a human right is not necessarily universally recognized. But now is not necessarily the time to dwell on all of that. I might just quickly pass over to Michael before we step into the goals of AI regulation. Michael, did you have any comments to share?
Just the agentic discussion just then reminded me of company CS India. A couple of years ago, they appointed ChatGPT as their CEO, which I think you could say probably was more of a publicity stunt than anything else. But I think there are organizations out there that are using AI as advisors, and I guess that it comes back to even broader corporate governance. What part can AI play in that broader governance and accountability roles? How a governance structure is going to change at a corporate level over the next 5 to 10 years. Just a very interesting point. Bit of thought exercise for now, but an interesting one.
Yeah, but that's a lovely segue into the thought exercise of what are we trying to achieve with the regulation of this new technology? And particularly, obviously, we'll start in Australia, but then looking at the way that the Australian approach aligns or doesn't with what's happening in some of the other major jurisdictions around the world. And so, Michael, I might ask you to continue on.
Sure. So I guess if we think, we've covered a bit about the EU AI Act, and as Kieran said, they're kind of leading the way with what regulation could look like for artificial intelligence. But there's, I guess, some contrasting points of view around, almost philosophical perspectives. So take away the jurisdictions, and the EU is perhaps, more on the, altruistic side, where they're looking at there's potential harms here, maybe even existential harms. There are some that would suggest that artificial general intelligence, artificial superintelligence, if we get there, will be an existential threat to humanity. And we really need to have guardrails in place now to ensure that, if we are heading down that track, that, humanity is protected and is safe and aligns with all of the values and goals that Kieran mentioned earlier. That is one philosophical perspective. And on the other side, you've got the accelerationists who say, well, AI is going to solve all of the world's problems. It's going to solve climate change. It's going to solve poverty. We're all going to have a universal basic income, or whatever it is that utopia looks like. And we shouldn't be putting barriers in place if that's where we want to get to. By putting all these barriers in place, we're slowing down our progress to that end goal, if that is the end goal. So there's those two sort of philosophical divides, and obviously there's spectrums in the middle. But if we take the EU AI Act, I always think of Old MacDonald's farm whenever I try and say that. But if we take that sort of extreme and then compare it to the US, the US had executive orders back when Biden was in power. They had the AI blueprint that they prepared. Now, since then, the Trump administration has revoked a number of the AI related executive orders that were under the Biden administration, and has taken a very pro-innovation approach to AI in the US, wanting to become that world leader from that technological perspective. So recent executive order that came out was to, I forget the name of it, but it was basically to remove barriers to development in the US. I just find it very interesting that you've got this divide across those two different regions, where I think even some of the bigger players are American firms, and they want to sell their products globally, of course. So I think there's been a little bit of geopolitical tension here as well, where there's pressure on the EU to say, well, maybe these things you have in place are too strong. So there's probably a few power plays happening, beyond the scope of my full scope to understand, but I think they are playing out, at the moment. And I guess that's the sort of geographical divide, those two different spectrums. But I guess we've also got the different sectors are also playing their part in AI regulation. We've got healthcare, financial services. Obviously they're a bit more on the the cutting edge when it comes to regulation because of the types of services, the potential harms, whether it's financial hardships or health outcomes. So they're usually putting in place a little bit more, and they're still a bit scattered, obviously, per for each individual regulator. One thing I do want to just touch on again with the US approach, which I found was quite an interesting approach, was because there isn't a federal legislation for AI in the US, states were implementing their own own legislation at the state level for different parts of AI. Some were around deepfakes and some were around privacy components. But then the Trump administration proposed a 10-year ban on states enforcing their own laws, or having the states be penalized if they did enforce those laws. Now that never got up, that never progressed. It was put down to 5 and then it was removed recently, but it's found another really interesting approach, where it was kind of like a blanket approach to, no, we really need this innovation. It kind of points to your point about democracy earlier, Kieran. Because we don't want to get too political as to what's right and wrong there, but I just found that a really interesting kind of approach as we see this play out, on the global stage.
Yeah, thank you. It is interesting, and I mean, it's obviously in the context of Australia, it would seem on the face of it that the Australian government is moving to more closely align perhaps with the EU approach rather than the American approach, the accelerationist approach. But Claire, what are you seeing in this space?
Definitely defer to Michael and Kieran on the regulation itself, but in terms of when we're talking about things like agentic AI and developments and emergent technology, kind of going back to the risk-based framework that Kieran mentioned earlier. So the EU AI Act doesn't actually refer specifically to new technologies like agentic AI. It defers back to the risk-based taxonomy. So when we think of a development in AI like agentic AI, it may well raise some of those risks that are within that risk-based framework. Is probably more likely to raise those risks because of its more proactive and more autonomous nature. But in terms of the regulation itself, I'll have to defer to the experts on the call, Michael and Kieran.
No worries. Thank you. So look, we might now move on to where we're at in Australia, because, as I'm sure sort of people who have been at least maintaining some sort of interest in this, there have been aspects where regulators or the federal government as well have looked at ways of supporting existing legislation with an interpretation of how that can look through the lens of AI. But what I might do is turn to Kieran to see what is the current state of play here.
Thanks, Michael. And I think it's a really good segue from Michael, how your considerations of how sector-based developments start to come through. We start looking at regulation. When we think about how things are operating geopolitically, while we can talk about the EU as being the gold standard, the reality is that we're seeing different countries take and follow different paths. We've had a discussion about the US. There would be a potential discussion in there around China and other countries where different AI regulatory blocks will start to form, and different countries are probably going to be shifting over time as to where they align their regulatory future in this area. Australia is an interesting one because we have a lot of, models to potentially follow. We have a lot of pathways we could go down depending upon where we do want to align ourselves geopolitically on regulation like this. But let's think about the current state of play. When we look at the current landscape, while we haven't formally adopted a legislative model like the EU AI Act, as I mentioned, extraterritorially, we might still need to comply with it, regardless of how we might want to position it. It's very clear, though, that even if we don't have a legislative model like the EU AI Act in place, that approach is shaping local conversations. It's prompting regulators and industry leaders to consider that risk-based approach to governance, especially in high impact applications or high impact industries. This global pressure clearly is leading Australia to explore its own frameworks. Particularly, it started with voluntary standards and those sector-led initiatives. A key recent example was the voluntary AI safety standard that was released about 12 months ago at this point, which outlines 10 key guardrails for responsible AI use. And these include concepts we've already touched upon: transparency, human oversight, stakeholder engagement. Alongside this, mandatory guardrails were proposed for high risk AI applications, again taking that risk-based approach, and these are still in consultation. The Productivity Commission actually released an interim report recently that does recommend pausing broad AI legislation, again advocating for adapting existing laws and seeing how gaps can be filled. So it's actually an important point for us to think about, well, if we didn't have a broad AI Act, which we don't right now, if we did just choose to fill those gaps, what would that actually look like? Well, our existing regulatory framework already does apply to AI and regulate AI. The Privacy Act, for example, the OAIC has clarified that AI generated or inferred personal data still needs to comply with the Australian privacy principles. AI systems that use critical infrastructure still need to meet the security of critical infrastructure legislation. And then, of course, you've got financial services, as Michael touched upon. We've got CPS 230, which invariably applies. And then you've got other sectoral initiatives like in healthcare initiatives that the TGA have started to explore. Now, these existing frameworks provide a foundation, but there is also a lot of ethical discussion going on in Australia. So AI ethics principles, they're voluntary, but they're widely adopted. And they're obviously something that's in place. And then there's also OAIC guidance around how to undertake AI with AI products, so privacy by design, these kinds of aspects. Another thing to bear in mind is that when we think about global frameworks, and we haven't really touched upon international standards, but it's probably a good point to bring in here because Australia is also adopting global standards. There's actually a global standard for AI governance that came out last year, and this is obviously a key system standard for organizations that do have AI systems in place to align to from a regulatory perspective. Regulation is not just about standards, of course, it's also about policy direction and public accountability, and there's been a lot of moves around this particularly in terms of what the government is doing around responsible use of AI in development. But it's pretty clear that the regulatory landscape is still being shaped by ongoing consultations and submissions. So we don't quite know where it's going to land yet. It could go in a few different directions, but I think the key thing for organizations, particularly when, as we've talked about from the poll previously, that awareness of the need to adapt, it's important to be agile and responding to shifts in regulation and having that horizon scanning mindset of looking at what's coming up from other countries and how different geopolitical developments might be influencing things.
Thank you, Kieran. While you were talking, it occurred to me that maybe the term AI and the bundling of everything that falls into that category under one umbrella may not necessarily be the most useful approach in dealing with elements of it, because as we'll explore in a moment, when we're talking a little bit more about agentic AI, there's a difference between using an LLM as a tool to parse through and generate summaries or create synergies with a variety of documents, and having what can potentially be effectively a separate legal entity acting on your behalf. Do you see in the way that Australia is approaching that there's a meaningful distinction between those two different things, where one might be simply a tool and the other one might be something akin to an individual?
I think that to echo what Claire said earlier, I don't want to get too far into the legalities of some of these points. I would probably echo a similar sentiment. One thing I would say is that much like the broader, we do look at it from an AI perspective, the nature of the law and regulation is needing to evolve and adapt to account for what is essentially a different state of play. We've gone through this and we look at things like autonomous vehicles. There was a bit of a reflection point when we look at legislation as to how does this current framework we have in place to regulate and to structure our society, does it suit this new wave of development that's taken place? And I think that there's a little bit of a reflection around that goes in as well. But again, it comes back to when we think about the legal frameworks around these areas, the ethical component is an important aspect as well, because what comes through in the regulation does come back to the ethical use of the technology and what's responsible. And certainly for us as an organization, that responsible use of AI is a critical part of how we do business, and it's going to be a critical part of how we as a society move forward navigating these concepts.
Yeah, and that's sorry, Claire, you go.
Sorry, Michael. Just to your point earlier, Michael, about artificial intelligence kind of encompassing a multitude of different things. I just wanted to speak to that a little bit because I think it is an interesting point and something that we need to bear in mind as we talk about kind of regulation and ethics and so on, governance of AI. Artificial intelligence is not really a term of art within technology, or I think anywhere. It's kind of a very broad umbrella concept that encompasses this idea of having a machine, a computer, doing tasks or thinking, quote unquote, thinking in ways that mimic human intelligence. So like reasoning, making decisions, perceiving, creating. It doesn't refer to a specific technique or a specific system. It's a very broad concept. So I think when it's becoming kind of increasingly clear to me, and when I kind of attend events and attend webinars like this, it becomes very difficult to talk about the specifics because we're like referring back to a very broad concept, which is artificial intelligence. And now, obviously, we had that big kind of rush on AI 3 years ago with ChatGPT and generative AI. Now it seems that there is so much kind of technological advancement and development going on every week that it becomes very difficult to understand like exactly what the risks are of a particular new development. So I think that needs to kind of be borne steadily in mind. I don't have a clear answer for it apart from like keep up to date with every single AI development and every single product and every single risk. But if anyone in the audience or has kind of had trouble keeping up and understanding exactly what we talk about when we talk about artificial intelligence, that's probably why. It does encompass a multitude of different models, different techniques, different systems. And I know I keep referring back to agentic AI because that's the latest new thing. But in agentic AI, it's a model, a large language model, or multiple large language models working with a bunch of different tools. So a bunch of different interfaces, might be working with the open internet, application programming interfaces to make sure that it can talk to different tools, search engines, and so on. So I think it will become increasingly important to understand, if we're thinking about the governance, risk, regulation position in relation to a specific system, it will become very important to understand exactly what that does at a technical level as well as kind of an outcome level. So just kind of sparked me off, Michael, that kind of comment about artificial intelligence, broad concept. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you for ventilating that a little bit more. Sorry, someone was going to say something.
I'm just going to jump in a little bit there on that as well, Michael, because I hear a phrase quite often and people ask the question, you suggest a problem that you're having or you're talking about a concept and they say, have you tried using AI for that? And usually what they mean is, have you tried prompting a large language model? But they might not have the language to know the different types of AI that Claire's just mentioned. You know, there's it was an AlphaGo, which is built specifically to play the game of Go, or Deep Blue was built to play chess specifically. Their AI model was for a very specific use case. And I think you're right, Claire. It's very much about the literacy, AI literacy that people need to have, and that it needs to form part of your governance model, knowing what AI can achieve and how you can do it reliably and consistently, and aligned with the values that we've been covering today, fairness and so on. So yeah, I think it's the AI literacy piece is absolutely critical.
Yeah, and actually, Michael, that leads me to a point that I was going to turn to you about. When we talk about risk, it's about modulating bad outcomes. When we're looking at the vast scope of capacities that are available under this broad catch-all term of AI, how do you see the challenge that legislators have when it comes to, because inevitably legislation reflects hopefully to a large extent, cultural expectations. How do you see legislators trying to manage risk when the risk isn't yet clearly defined?
Very tricky one. So I might just, so you mentioned there about that risk management is about modulating the risk, but it should be about achieving outcomes. So at a societal level, that is, governments, regulators trying to achieve positive outcomes for, for their, constituents, whether that is, recipients of financial services or health services or whatever the case is. That's at that, I guess, societal level. And we cover risk appetite at an organizational level, which many of our people on this call probably have in their own organization. But the regulation kind of is that risk appetite of society, which kind of sets the baseline. Now, organizations might have their own risk appetite, which is different. They're not willing to cross certain boundaries, even though they might be legal. It's that boundary of, well, I can, but should I? So I think that's a really interesting boundary. But to your point about what's that level, I think it's challenging, and knowing what all the different risks are, to Claire's point, it's very difficult to know them all. We've got a lot of resources that are out there at the moment. I know the MIT have their AI risk repository, has 1,600 risks or something like that listed today. Whether to convert that into something a little bit more usable, it's a big list, but it's a good resource. So there's a lot of, I guess, research that is being done in this space. So there's still a lot of, I guess, horizon scanning that needs to be done. And as these new models are being developed and new use cases, because it's not just about the technology itself, as Claire mentioned, there's lots of different types of technologies, but it's then what are the use cases within organizations, whether that's private organizations, whether it's within government, within regulators themselves. I know a number of the regulators to get their hands on this stuff have been, or to get a better handle of it, have got their own regulatory sandboxes that they create with AI. So they're both allowing themselves to use it, so they understand it as regulators, as well as allowing their regulated entities to come in and use their sandbox so they can see how those entities are going to be using it safely. So I think that is a way that regulators can bridge that gap and understand those risks, is to work with their regulated entities to know, how they're evolving, what they're intending to do with AI. I think that collaborative approach, I see that probably a little bit more with, I guess, my experience. It seems like APRA, for example, is a lot more collaborative, where they released CPS 230, they did a lot of consultation. So I think there is, at least in some sectors, more of that collaborative approach that will help those regulators define some of those regulatory boundaries that they want to enforce.
To
Yeah,
your point about, sorry, Michael, I keep interrupting your
Not at all.
facilitation. I just wanted to go back to one of your points, Michael, about problems and use cases. I just want to kind of emphasize how important it is to kind of think from a use case or problem focus rather than from the technology first. It's a little bit difficult to avoid with AI because it's so all-consuming and everyone needs to be using AI in their processes and so on. There's a lot of impetus to do that. But my experience as a product manager is that if you start with the technology first and then try and figure out the problem that you're trying to solve, you probably won't get good adoption. It's very difficult to understand how it will work within people's workflows, and by extension, difficult to understand like what the risks are and how you can manage those, because you can't effectively measure it against the problem or the use case that you're trying to solve. So I think sometimes when you're thinking about AI adoption in an organization or where you're going to use AI, it's really helpful to just do a bit of a status quo assessment of what your processes are, what your workflows are, where your pain points are, and how AI might be able to help with those, and what are the problems and what are the risks inherent in that application. And I think that ties in quite well with something like the EU AI Act risk-based assessment, because they're looking at particular purposes, which ties into use cases. So yeah, just wanted to kind of touch on that again, Michael.
Thank you. Now, look, we've actually got a question in the chat that was actually preempting where I was going to go next with this. So whoever that was, thank you very much. Question was, while the regulators are figuring it out, are the voluntary standards the best approach for organizations who are adapting? Which I guess, the question that I was going to pose was, we've got a sense of where we are now, but what does the panel see where we might be in 12 months or 2 years' time when it comes to regulation in Australia? And Kieran, I might start with you first.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think a question like this does tap into the fact that we've discussed a lot of different frameworks. We've said, oh, there's this one in Europe, there's this one in the US, there's this in Australia, and it's not quite mandatory yet, but maybe it'll get that way. And there's this voluntary one over here, and also there's this international standard. Maybe you can think about that. That's a lot of information. It's like, which path do I follow? And we can point at what each framework does well and what some of its deficiencies are. We've spent a lot of time talking about the EU AI Act and what it does well in terms of the risk-based approach, but what some of those challenges might be and whether it does enough, whether it needs to be wound back enough. Ultimately, the most important thing for what to follow is going to be first and foremost what your actual requirements are, and we have to start with what are your obligations, and what your obligations are is going to depend upon who are you as an organization, what do you do, where do you do business, and that's going to conjure up a lot of different considerations of what frameworks to consider. So the best approach, it sounds a little bit of a cop-out, but the best approach is what's right for you as an organization, but also what your appetite is and what your goals are around your compliance maturity and that as well. The ideal scenario is that you can comply with everything and you can follow all of these frameworks and try to meet the best approach and the best practice across all of those different areas. I think the other key thing would be the best approach is to what we've talked about a lot today, is to adopt that forward-looking proactive view, look at what's coming over the horizon, and try and align yourself as closely as you can, point to that target and say, okay, we've got all these different frameworks, here are the things they're touching upon, here's the approaches that are consistent, and aligning yourself proactively with what you can see coming up. Because if you're able to take that proactive view of compliance, then you give yourself that opportunity to be in the best possible position for when something lands, so that you're not reacting, and therefore it puts you in a really positive competitive position in terms of how you operate as a business, but also how you present yourself to society and to the market.
Thank you, Kieran. Look, I'm mindful of time. This is one of those conversations that we could probably spend all week on, probably, but we have promised an hour, so we'll try and keep it to an hour, as close to that as we can. We might quickly then turn to our second poll, and if people could just spend a minute or so just having a look at where, in terms of the way that you as an organization are employing AI, where you see your organization is at the moment, whether it's simply at that initial sort of scoping phase where people are beginning to find individual use cases for it, or whether it's something that as an organization you've rolled out as some sort of resource across the organization, and of course all points in between. One of the questions, there's some questions beginning to feed into the chat now, looks at how this AI and the broad scope of things that are available to us under that umbrella term, whether the results that we get from its use are predicated on the qualities and experience of the person using it. We'll save that question for the end, but I think it's a fascinating use of the word tool, because I think, to a large extent, anything can be either a tool or a toy or a weapon. And obviously what we're exploring today is the tool aspect of that. But I just wanted to put the rest of the panel on notice that there's some fascinating questions coming up for the Q&A, which is why we're now at poll 2, and hopefully we'll have time to explore some of these issues. Now, the poll results are in. Michael, would you speak to them for me?
I certainly can. So the majority, I would say that the highest result was no formal AI initiatives, so people are using it for individual use. We didn't clarify, but perhaps that's individual use for themselves, or maybe there's individual use across the organisation. The next highest was AI pilots, but don't know how to scale, so that was 33%. So we've got a total on the top two, 26%. Either they've successfully rolled out initiatives or have confidence that pilots will scale. So 26, so about a quarter have confidence or are scaling, but yeah, it looks like a lot of people are still in that early phase. Yeah, either don't know how to scale or are just using it individually.
Yeah, and look, I think that sits well with some of the feedback that we've had when we're talking about the use of AI across our client base, and I suspect, Michael, across yours as well. Thank you all for your feedback in relation to that. Now, we've talked around the topic of agentic AI for the bulk of this morning, but what I might now do is let's focus specifically on agentic AI. And what I'd like to do is invite Claire to grant us the benefit of her wisdom in relation to this particular topic.
You're very kind, Michael. I hope that's not overstating my
Not at all.
wisdom on the topic, but thank you. So I've already touched on agentic AI a few times. I'll just go back into the definition just to kind of re-ground us in that. So as I mentioned, generative AI, more of a back and forth between the prompter, you, the user, and the model, being mostly a large language model, so a model that produces fluent text or other modalities in response to user prompts. So it's conditioned by the prompt that the user enters, and that prompt and the back and forth conversation is part of what provides context for the response itself. So there is kind of a dependency on you, the user, taking action to produce output. What agentic AI does is take the large language model, something like a GPT or Claude by Anthropic, and there are now many other large language models, and use that as part of an entire system, and that system's objective, or that system's reason for being, is to pursue its own, it's to pursue objectives and goals. And part of what has enabled agentic systems to come into being fairly recently, although you can kind of see more rules-based agents going back in time prior to the current wave of generative AI and AI advancements. What has allowed this to come into being and to become more powerful and more able to be deployed across multiple use cases is the kind of advancement in reasoning capacity. So when generative AI first came into being, there wasn't a lot of thinking going on behind. I use the word thinking very advisedly because does a machine think? I think that's a whole other question. It's very philosophical. It was a very quick response based on some contextual information in the prompt. It was kind of like system one thinking, if anyone is familiar with Daniel Kahneman's thinking fast and slow. What the reasoning advancement has done is allow the large language model to think through the answer step by step in a way that makes it more likely to lead to correct outcomes, particularly in logical problems. So if anyone is interested in reading AI research papers, might be a couple of people on the call, there is a great paper from a few years ago called Chain of Thought Prompting Elicits Reasoning in Large Language Models. And that is about being able to elicit reasoning via asking the large language model to basically reason step by step. So like take a breath, reason step by step, and go through the problem. So that really prompted a kind of step change in how a large language model was able to reason through a problem. And that ability to reason has really fed into the ability for large language models to act as a reasoning engine in agentic AI systems. So to go back to agentic AI systems themselves with a bit of that background, they perform tasks quite autonomously as an entire system together with tools that may include databases, the internet, search engines, APIs, with the help of a reasoning engine, which is the LLM or multiple LLMs, to kind of route or decide how to perform those objectives and achieve those goals. There's also other kind of elements of agentic AI, including like continuous learning, being able to dynamically adjust to parts of the environment to achieve goals. In terms of what agentic AI can be used for, we can go back to this kind of discussion about use cases and problems. Agentic AI, I think, could be potentially deployed to any particular business problem or customer problem. So the range of applications are very, very broad. Obviously, when we talk about AI, we're constantly talking about risks and opportunities. Like that is how the conversation is really frequently framed. Agentic AI, because it has the characteristics that I've mentioned about autonomy, achieving objectives, evidently presents new and probably greater risks than other AI systems. But again, as we spoke about, really depends on what you're trying to do, what the agentic system is trying to do, what context it's in. So you might see a different level of risk in a healthcare context versus a customer service context versus a legal context. So that's really important. There's also risks that relate to kind of characteristics of agentic AI that are enhanced vis-a-vis generative AI. So for example, in agentic AI, you might see an increased level of personalization to create, or customization might be the better term, to create, to understand exactly what the context of an organization is, the context of customers, and to be able to deliver a tailored response or a tailored outcome. So with a level of personalization, you're obviously talking about a huge amount of data, and there's data governance, privacy and security considerations there. When we're thinking about achieving objectives and achieving goals, one, there's an alignment issue. So is this alignment is a basic problem with AI. How do we ensure that an AI system is aligned with our goals and values generally? That's something that needs to be considered in relation to agentic AI. But in particular, you want to think about what are the unintended consequences. Might have unintended consequences if you're having a system function quite autonomously. So very, very interesting area, obviously kind of developing week by week. Those are some of the considerations you might need to take into account with agentic AI.
Thank you, Claire. I have a question, but I'll pass to Michael, just in case he answers it on the way through. Michael, did you have anything to add about this?
I think risk is risk is risk. So you still need to have solid risk frameworks in place, whether it is part of a broader enterprise risk framework or whether you do want something that's separate for AI risk. But AI risk affects all of the objectives of your organization or influences a lot of the other risks that already exist in the organization. So it's really about making sure that you've got a framework that covers that full spectrum in the organization. I think too, there's a range of these risks that Claire sort of touched on then, and the objectives of the organization, making sure that they're aligned. And when we think about agentic in particular and having the right controls in place, there's plenty of privacy and cyber related controls, a lot of frameworks for those, but the AI related ones are probably a bit more in development at the moment. So I think people are still feeling out what that looks like. And to Claire's point before, it's going to be based on your use case. How are you using AI in your organization? What are the goals, both for the organization and for your use case? And determining if you make this agentic and kind of walk away a little bit, what are some of the potential outcomes, and how often do you need to be checking in? Because even though they might be autonomous to a degree, there is a spectrum of how far we let it go before there is either a human in the loop, whether something needs to be escalated, will only be progressed if a human approves, or a human on the loop who can at least monitor what's happening. A good example might be AI enhanced cyber tools, which might be, if they're detecting intrusions, they need to act perhaps immediately. So you might have it act immediately, but then escalate that or alert someone that something has occurred. So it's thinking about what are those controls you need to have in place at that level. And also to Claire's point about the different LLMs, you might have 10 different agents running a whole workflow. All of those might have different configurations, different prompts that sit in the background, access to different tools, because they're all tailored to do something very specific. If they've got things like shared memory, what happens if you have a breakdown in one of those systems? One of them fails. How does that fail gracefully, and what's your backup? Are you going to have things in place like business continuity plans? If you've moved a call center team off because you've replaced them all with AI, what happens if those AI break down for 4 hours? The service provider is not available anymore. So you still got to manage all of those risks that currently exist in your organization. The context of them changes. So having strong risk management frameworks in place will help you manage those upfront, and then risk and change over time as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michael. I think that you've addressed a couple of the questions that have come through while we were talking. That then gets us through to Q&A, and there have been some fascinating questions. I guess one question that I'll throw open to the group in the 3 minutes we have left, and so we have a minute each, or you have a minute each, is to explore the anticipated reliance upon AI to effectively do a lot of the mental and possibly physical heavy lifting when we approach a particular topic, with the commensurate prejudice around the way that we as humans conduct ourselves. I'll start with Claire, and then we might defer to sort of Kieran and Michael in that order. Claire, do you get the sense of what the question's asking?
Absolutely. This is one of my favorite topics. So I was really glad to see this question come through. I think it's absolutely a fair concern. If anyone's familiar with kind of media theory, you might have heard of Marshall McLuhan and the idea that we shape our tools and our tools shape us. So I think it's very reasonable to be concerned that AI in particular will lead to a level of cognitive offloading. I don't have a very well-reasoned answer to that, but in my use of AI in my work, I try to be mindful of automation bias, our bias to kind of believe an automated response over our own response, which is correct. And something that I find helpful is to kind of think through a problem first myself, and then use AI as a kind of enhancement rather than going first to AI. Kind of your mileage may vary, that might not be necessary with some tasks, but on a broader societal level, I think it is definitely something that we need to really think about carefully, and what do we actually want to do with the time that is freed up by using AI tools. Kind of an open area for discussion.
Yeah, it's a fair point, and it's good to hear a shout out for Marshall McLuhan as well. Thank you. Kieran.
I'll be brief because Claire's done a fantastic job of covering off on that. I think that the automation bias is a key risk area for, regardless of what level you're at. For myself as a leader of a function, it's an area that I do keep front of mind in terms of how I supervise and manage my team to make sure that in the use of AI, and iceberg theory definitely applies when we think about the use of AI, regardless of what you know, there's more happening beneath the surface. And that's also a key risk area as well. But that automation bias is something to navigate and make sure that people have the level of understanding of what they're seeing, but also the confidence in themselves and their ability to give value to the conversation that they're having with a particular AI tool. The human verification is a super important part of that. And I think that one of the key things we need to think about is how do we ensure that the human verification remains a valuable component of the interaction with AI? Because the greater potential for cognitive laziness, the impact of the human in the loop is potentially going to diminish over time if we do consider ourselves to become more cognitively lazy. But that could be an entire webinar, I think, if we delved into that particular topic.
Indeed. And finally, Michael?
So I read an article probably a decade ago, which was that humanity, or many humans, had shifted from remembering specific facts to moving towards remembering how to find them once with the advent of the internet. And I think maybe now we're moving towards that sort of next phase, where I hope what we move towards is being able to have that cognitive challenge, I guess, where we know how to critique or have critical thinking skills, especially as we're interacting with AI, to know when and how to use it effectively, as well as when to challenge some of the responses. I find myself still writing a lot of my own content. Absolutely, I do use AI, but I still end up writing a lot because it helps with the thinking process, rather than outsourcing it all. So yeah, I still think there's a way to go here.
Definitely. Look, thank you all, both audience and panel, for your time and exploring some fascinating, deep, and hopefully ultimately practical ideas on what we're facing, certainly in Australia, but what we're facing around the world, both in terms of what we can employ AI as in terms of a tool, and the different ways that we expect that those tools will be managed, certainly at a regulatory level, and I suspect at an ethical and potentially moral level as well. Please raise your phones to the screens and download whatever documents you need. There was a query about the name of the research paper that Claire cited. We might send that out with the pack. But again, thank you all for your time, your attention today. I really hope it's been useful. As Michael mentioned, there could be an infinite number of AI webinar discussions to be had. But while we humans are still capable of doing them, I look forward to doing another one again with you soon. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.